a ghost seen only in glass, but its victim was real. Welcome to Eco Misteriosa. I am your host, Ravela. Where are you joining from tonight? Leave a comment below. Your messages always bring this mystery circle to life. Let's begin. It was in the last week of November, during one of those bitter London evenings when the damp seemed to cling to one's bones, that I found myself once again seated in the familiar quarters of 221B Baker Street. A thick fog had rolled in from the Thames, cloaking the streets in grey and giving even the most familiar shapes the semblance of phantoms. It was a fitting night, I thought, for the tale that was about to unfold, though at the time I could scarcely have imagined the strangeness of the events to come. Holmes had taken his usual seat by the fire, a black clay pipe resting between his fingers, the bowl gently smouldering. His eyes were fixed not upon the flames, but on the reflection within the narrow mirror above the mantelpiece, as if searching it for signs invisible to ordinary men. He had scarcely spoken a word in the past half hour, having received an urgent telegram just before sunset that appeared to stir him more than most. I was in the midst of reviewing my notes from our recent excursion to Dartmoor, a matter involving stolen letters and an ill-tempered stable-master, when the firm knock of a gloved hand sounded at our door. Mrs. Hudson, ever discreet, knocked once in return before ushering in our visitor with only the faintest rustle of fabric and hush of cold air. The man who entered was tall, meticulously dressed, and wore an expression of such distress that even Holmes straightened with interest. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," the man said quickly, glancing about the room as though expecting something to leap from the shadows. Holmes nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Indeed, and this is my associate, Doctor, John Watson. May I ask your name and what matter brings you out in such inhospitable weather?" "My name is Langford, Julian Langford. I apologize for the hour and the nature of my request, but I was told that no other man in London could help me." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Flattery may soothe some men, Mr. Langford, but it rarely earns them favor here. Proceed." Langford hesitated, then leaned forward in his chair. "It's about my sister, Miss Eliza Langford. She lives at the family estate, Langford House, in South Kensington. 3 nights ago, she swears she saw a ghost walk through a mirror in her bedroom." I must admit, I let out a quiet breath of disbelief. Holmes, however, said nothing. "A ghost, you say?" he said, tone unreadable. "I know how that sounds, Mr. Holmes. She is not prone to fancy or hysteria, but what makes it truly alarming is that ever since that night she's refused to speak or leave her room. She sits in a chair near the mirror, eyes fixed on it, as if waiting for something to come through again." "She's spoken of it to you, directly?" Holmes asked. "She described it to me the next morning. A man's figure, pale, not translucent, but wrong somehow. She said it stepped through the mirror as though it were water and stood at the foot of her bed. It said nothing, simply stared at her. Then it vanished the way it came." Holmes nodded slowly. "And you say she has not spoken since?" Not even to me. Our housekeeper is growing alarmed. I sent for her physician, but he found no signs of fever or physical ailment. I fear something terrible is at play." Holmes stood and began to pace, hands behind his back. "Tell me, Mr. Langford, do you believe in ghosts?" The man blinked. I believe my sister believes in what she saw. That is enough." A diplomatic answer. Holmes paused at the window, peering out into the fog. "What of the mirror itself? Has it ever been peculiar?" Langford frowned. "It's a family heirloom, a tall cheval glass, silver-trimmed, about 7 feet high. It once belonged to our great-grandmother. No stories attached to it that I know of." "Do you live alone in the house with your sister?" "Just the 2 of us, and 2 servants, Mrs. Weatherby, the housekeeper, and young James, our footman. And prior to the incident, nothing unusual. No sounds, no break-ins." Langford hesitated. There is one thing. Eliza had been receiving strange letters. No return address, no signature. At first they were harmless enough, quotes from poetry, riddles, but they grew darker. One line mentioned reflections that do not lie. She burned most of them, but I saw one before she did. Holmes turned back, his face intent. "You kept it?" "No, I'm afraid not. But she said she saw the same phrase, reflections that do not lie, whispered by the figure in her room." At this, Holmes looked sharply at me. "Watson, prepare your bag. We are going to Langford House." I stood at once. Tonight? Of course. The fog is the perfect cover for a man who wishes to step through unseen doors. Langford looked between us with visible relief, though still waited with unease. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I have a carriage waiting below." As we gathered our coats and stepped out into the cloying mist, I could not help but glance back at the mirror Holmes had been studying. It reflected only the firelight and shadows of our room. Mundane, undisturbed. And yet, as the door closed behind us, I could have sworn it shimmered, just for an instant. The fog had thickened by the time we emerged onto Baker Street, the street lamps casting blurred, golden halos through the mist as our footsteps echoed across wet cobblestones. Langford's carriage awaited us at the curb, its horses stamping anxiously as if they too sensed something amiss. Holmes entered first without a word, folding himself into the shadowy interior with the practiced elegance of a man already deep in thought. I followed, and we were off. Into the night, the carriage wheels humming softly beneath us. Langford sat opposite us, his gloves twisting in his lap. "I ought to mention," he said after a silence, "that my sister was not the only one to see something odd that night. Mrs. Weatherby, our housekeeper, told me she heard voices from Eliza's room just moments before the scream. She claims she only heard Eliza's voice, but that it was as though she were answering someone, or something." Holmes turned his gaze toward him, the carriage's interior light catching the gleam of his eyes. A curious distinction. Voices heard, but only one identified. "Did she investigate?" "She reached the room shortly after Eliza screamed. She found my sister on the floor, trembling with the mirror perfectly intact. No sign of disturbance, but Eliza insisted the figure passed through it like mist and stood right before her." Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "And you say the mirror is old? Victorian, perhaps Georgian?" "Georgian, yes. Our great-grandmother's, as I mentioned. The glass has never been replaced, and the frame is heavy silver, inlaid with ivory details. Quite a valuable piece." "Valuable, indeed," Holmes murmured, mostly to himself, "and possibly more than in just monetary terms." The rest of the journey passed in silence, broken only by the muffled clatter of hooves and the rhythmic creak of the carriage. The streets of South Kensington were nearly deserted by the time we arrived, the houses standing like solemn sentinels in the fog. Langford's estate, though not ostentatious, bore the elegance of old wealth, an ivy-covered townhouse with iron railings, gaslight flickering faintly by the front door. We were admitted by a somber young footman, James, whose downcast eyes and subdued manner suggested the house had fallen under a shadow. He took our coats and led us into a drawing room where a fire crackled quietly. Holmes made no move to sit. Instead, he walked to the fireplace, scanned the mantel, then turned sharply. "I would like to see the mirror first," he said, "and then speak with your housekeeper." Langford nodded. "This way." We followed him up the broad staircase, our footsteps muffled by thick carpeting. At the end of the hallway, Langford paused before a tall oak door. He knocked gently and waited. No answer came. "Eliza," he called softly. "I've brought Mr. Holmes. He's here to help." Still no reply. He pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp on the bedside table. Eliza Langford sat in a high-backed chair near the far wall, wrapped in a dark shawl, her eyes fixed unblinkingly on the enormous mirror that stood opposite her. It dominated the room, taller than a man, wide enough to span nearly half the wall. Its silver frame was tarnished with age, but the glass gleamed with eerie clarity, reflecting every flicker of light with unnatural sharpness. Eliza made no move, no sound as we entered. Her face was pale, almost waxen, her eyes wide but unfocused. Holmes approached with quiet steps, pausing beside the mirror without glancing at his reflection. He studied the edges, the base, the joints. Then, very gently, he rapped on the glass with the knuckle of one hand. It gave off a sound, dull but not hollow. "No cracks," he said quietly. "No signs of tampering. Interesting." He turned to Eliza. "Miss Langford," he said, his voice soft but firm. "My name is Sherlock Holmes. Your brother has asked me to investigate what happened here. I will not press you for anything you cannot give, but if there is any detail you remember, any feeling, even a fleeting impression, it may help." She blinked once, and her gaze shifted from the mirror to him. Slowly, she opened her mouth. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse and whisper-thin. "He had no eyes." Holmes leaned slightly forward. "The figure in the mirror?" She nodded. "He looked at me, but his face, where the eyes should be, there was only smooth skin, like wax." A shiver went through me. Holmes nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. "And did he say anything to you?" Eliza closed her eyes. "Not with words, but I heard him. In my mind. He said, 'The mirror remembers.'" Holmes turned abruptly. "That will be all for now. Miss Langford, rest. I will do everything in my power to understand this." Outside the room, Holmes paused in the hallway, tapping his fingers against the railing. "Watson, did you notice the temperature in that room?" It felt colder than the rest of the house. "Precisely. A small discrepancy, perhaps, but worth noting. Now, let us find Mrs. Weatherby." She awaited us in the kitchen, a stout woman in her late 50s, eyes red from worry. Holmes greeted her with a nod. "You were the first to enter the room after Miss Langford screamed." "I was, sir. I sleep just down the hall. I ran in and found her on the floor, crying, shaking all over." "You mentioned hearing voices." She looked hesitant. "I heard Miss Eliza, that's true, but there was something else. I can't say it was a voice like you and I would speak. More like a tone, a sound that wasn't sound. It made my teeth ache." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "Have you ever experienced anything similar in this house before?" She shook her head. "Never. Not in 30 years. Has the mirror ever been moved?" "Not since before I came here. Too heavy, and Miss Eliza always said it belonged exactly where it stood." Holmes turned to Langford. "May I assume you still have the key to your great-grandmother's journal or private belongings?" Langford looked surprised. "Her journals?" "They're in a trunk in the attic, I believe." "I want access to them, immediately." He nodded, already turning toward the stair. Holmes turned to me once Langford had gone. "Watson, what do you make of it?" I hesitated. "It's unnerving, but I hesitate to call it supernatural." "As do I," Holmes murmured. "There is no such thing as a ghost. Only an unexplained mechanism waiting to be revealed." "But mirrors, Watson. Mirrors are peculiar things. They reflect the truth, yes, but only what they are shown." Just then, Langford reappeared, holding a stack of weathered journals. Holmes took them and fanned through quickly. "Excellent," he muttered, then stopped on a page. His eyes narrowed. "What is it?" I asked. He turned the journal toward me. Written in faded ink, beneath a sketch of the very same mirror, were the words, "Object acquired 1834. Venice. Said to be from the fallen monastery of the Veiled Brothers. Warned not to sleep near it." Holmes closed the book with a snap. "Watson," he said with sudden urgency, We need to watch that mirror tonight. All night. And as the clock struck midnight and the fire died down in Langford House, I felt the first true chill of dread. Holmes had once said the world held no ghosts. I began to wonder if that was still true. The hours between midnight and dawn passed with a weight that defied the passage of time. Holmes and I had taken up quiet vigil in Eliza Langford's bedroom, both seated in stillness while the mirror loomed before us like some mute sentinel. A single oil lamp burned low on the writing desk, its light too feeble to reach the far corners of the chamber. Shadows played tricks at the edges of vision, and every creak of the floorboards seemed somehow magnified. Miss Langford had reluctantly agreed to let us remain, though she herself had refused to re-enter the room. She was now resting under mild sedation, attended by the housekeeper. Holmes, as ever, required no stimulant beyond his own mind. He sat in the high-backed chair beside the mirror, legs crossed, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze unflinching. I occupied a smaller chair nearer the bed, my notebook open but largely neglected. It was close to 3 o'clock when Holmes stirred, breaking the long silence. "Tell me, Watson," he said, voice low, "have you ever considered what a mirror actually is?" I blinked, jarred by the question. A reflection, a reversal of light. Nothing more? Precisely. And yet we invest it with such superstition. Mirrors that steal souls, trap spirits, reverse truth. Why? Because it shows what we see, but never tells us what we miss. I rubbed my eyes. Holmes, I'd rather not delve into metaphysics at this hour. What exactly are we waiting for? He leaned forward, tapping the side of the mirror lightly with a fingernail. Not a ghost, Watson, a pattern. He stood suddenly and crossed to the writing desk, retrieving a small leather case. From it, he produced a series of fine tools, a jeweler's loop, a strip of smoked glass, a folded square of dark velvet. One by one, he began examining the frame of the mirror in deliberate segments. "The marks here," he murmured. "Do you see the tiny scratches at the joint of the lower edge?" I joined him and peered closer. Indeed, at the silvered corner where the base met the stand, there were faint, almost invisible abrasions. "Not consistent with age," Holmes said. "This was pried open, recently. Opened, but it's a solid mirror." Holmes pressed his fingers against the inner curve of the base and gave a quick twist. To my astonishment, the lower panel of the frame shifted outward with a soft click, revealing a narrow recess inside the stand. He reached in and withdrew something wrapped in oilcloth. He peeled the cloth away carefully. Inside was a slim velvet pouch and, beneath that, a sheaf of letters neatly folded and bound with twine. Holmes said nothing as he handed them to me. The parchment was old, brittle to the touch. The handwriting was not Eliza's, but elegant and precise, signed repeatedly with the initials H.L. The contents, however, were disturbing. One letter read, "The mirror shows what the eye denies. I have seen him again tonight, he who walks the border of glass and shadow. He comes when I dream. I fear sleep. I fear that I shall be pulled through and none will see me go." Another, "It is not madness." The brothers in Venice warned me. Do not look too long, lest it look back. The mirror holds not just reflection, but memory. I have sealed it, but I feel him breathing at the threshold. I looked up. "Holmes, these are from your great-grandmother, I presume." "Miss Langford's great-grandmother," he corrected. "Hester Langford. It would appear she too encountered something." Holmes now turned his attention to the mirror again, this time kneeling. He retrieved a small vial from his coat and dabbed a solution across a narrow strip of the silver backing near the edge. Within moments, the chemical agent clouded a portion of the mirror. Beneath the tarnished surface, faint lines began to emerge, scratches that had been etched long ago, concealed beneath the polish. Holmes held the lamplight closer and read aloud. "He walks when watched. Watson, he said, rising. "This mirror has been modified. There is something behind it." Together, we shifted the mirror from the wall. It was heavier than it appeared, and with Langford's assistance, whom we summoned from his room, we managed to tilt it forward just enough to expose a narrow cavity behind the wall. Within that recess was a small, door-like panel fitted flush into the wood, with hinges along one side and a latch at the top. Holmes pried it open. The compartment was empty, no figures lurking in shadow, no ghastly visions, but the back of the panel bore more markings. Diagrams, circles within squares, strange symbols not immediately familiar. "What do you make of these?" I asked, frowning at the curious glyphs. Holmes was already pulling a reference from his satchel. "Occult, symbology," he said, "but not mere superstition. Many secret societies, particularly in Italy during the early 19th century, concealed knowledge behind esoteric language. This one," he pointed to a twisted loop intersected by a cross, "appears in the alchemical notes of Father Caligari, one of the last monks of the Veiled Brothers." Langford said the mirror was brought from a monastery in Venice. Indeed, and the brothers were reputed not only to dabble in symbolic theology, but in optics, specifically the use of mirrors for psychological manipulation. They believed the mirror was a gate, not a barrier. Langford, watching us from the doorway, now stepped forward. "So you're suggesting this mirror was intentionally altered to create an illusion? A trick? Or to open a passage," Holmes said, though not in the literal sense. "No man walks through glass, but someone, knowing the mirror's history, could use it to create the impression of such a phenomenon. A hallucination? Not necessarily. More likely, a staged effect, but one designed with such precision that the mind is drawn into belief, and belief, as you've seen, can alter behavior. Your sister's withdrawal is not from madness, it is from fear." We lowered the mirror back into place and sealed the panel behind it. "Holmes," I said slowly, "you mentioned we were watching for a pattern. What did you mean?" 3 nights ago, Miss Langford seized the figure. Tonight is the 3rd since then. If it returns, it will be tonight." I stared at the mirror, unease crawling up my spine. "You believe someone is deliberately entering this room?" Holmes nodded. "Or projecting themselves into it. From where, we do not yet know, but I intend to find out." We made our preparations silently. Holmes set a bell wire trap across the base of the window, sprinkled fine ash before the door and mirror, and adjusted the lamp to throw maximum light toward the frame. Then, with Langford now armed with a pistol and seated outside the room, Holmes and I resumed our vigil, hidden behind a folding screen. The minutes ticked past in oppressive quiet. I found my eyes drifting to the mirror again and again, as if drawn by some magnetic pull. The reflection showed only the room, the bed, the lamp, the window, but still there was something off. A delay in the flicker of the light, a shudder in the surface when nothing moved. Then, just after 4, the temperature dropped, noticeably. My breath misted. I saw Holmes stiffen. The mirror shimmered, not cracked, not breaking, shimmered, as if the surface of the glass had turned to water, and from the shimmer, a figure stepped. It was not ghostly, not transparent, but its face. Smooth, eyeless, pale as polished wax. Holmes did not move. His hand closed around the small canister at his belt. The figure advanced, noiseless. It reached the middle of the room, and the bell wire snapped. Holmes sprang forward, hurled the contents of the canister toward the figure, and shouted, "Now, Watson!" The light flared, brilliant magnesium flame, and in that flash, the figure let out a gasp, not inhuman, but human, and staggered backward. Not through the mirror, toward the wall. A concealed panel swung open. The figure vanished. Holmes gave chase without hesitation. I stumbled after him, my heart pounding. Whoever had been inside the mirror had not entered from the spirit world. They had come through a hidden door, into the room from behind, and someone in the house had been letting them in. The passage behind the mirror was narrower than I expected. Little more than a service corridor, its plaster walls rough and unfinished, dust clinging to the damp air. Holmes darted ahead with the speed of a bloodhound that had caught the scent. I followed, half blinded from the flare of the magnesium and the afterimage of that pale, eyeless figure still lingering behind my eyes. The boards creaked beneath our feet. Somewhere ahead I heard the scuffle of a hurried step, a loose shoe scraping stone. Holmes rounded a corner and threw open a door that led into the adjoining storage chamber, dimly lit by a half-shuttered window. It was empty, no figure, no sound. Only the stale scent of mildew and old linen. "Blast!" Holmes muttered, his breath quick. The passage must split elsewhere. He turned in place, eyes flickering across the crates, the iron-banded trunks, the dust. "Look here, Watson," he said, kneeling. "No footprints in the dust between the door and the window. He didn't pass through here." "Then where?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The passage must continue in another direction. Help me with this cabinet." We dragged a tall, rotting oak cabinet aside, revealing a narrow seam in the wall. With a swift motion, Holmes found the catch, well-worn, polished from repeated use, and pressed it. The panel gave way with a muted creak. Beyond was another stairwell descending into darkness. Holmes held up a finger. "Do you hear that?" At first I heard nothing. Then, faintly, the soft shuffle of footsteps below. Retreating. Without hesitation, Holmes slipped through the passage, and I followed, cursing every echo our boots gave off as we descended into the bowels of Langford House. The stairs ended in a low-ceilinged brick cellar, lit only by the flickering flame of a single oil lantern set on a crate. In its circle of light stood the figure, no longer ghostly, no longer supernatural. The illusion stripped bare by exposure. He wore a tight-fitting mask of pale wax, molded to resemble a human face, featureless, eyeless. His dark clothing blended into the shadows, and in his hand he held something glinting, a blade curved like a surgical scalpel. He saw us and ran. Holmes surged forward before I could even react. The man darted through another door, this one swinging on rusted hinges into a servant's corridor. We pursued, him through a winding maze of back rooms and cellar halls, up another set of stairs that led us to the east wing of the house, and then, quite suddenly, he vanished. There were no doors left open, no curtains drawn aside. The hallway was empty. Holmes held perfectly still, listening. We waited for nearly a minute. Then Holmes turned slowly, eyes scanning the hallway. He walked to a wall sconce and gave it a subtle nudge. Click! A hidden panel beside it swung open, revealing yet another crawl space, barely large enough to admit a man on his hands and knees. "He's gone to ground," Holmes muttered. "A mouse in his warren." We did not follow him further just then. Holmes instead marked the panel with chalk and closed it silently. We returned to the drawing room where Langford sat in an armchair, still clutching the pistol I'd handed him earlier. His eyes widened at our entrance. "Did you see him?" he asked, rising. "The man? The thing?" "We saw a man, yes," Holmes said briskly. "Masked, armed, and more importantly, in full command of the hidden passageways within this house." Langford stared at him. "You mean he lives here, in the walls?" "I mean he knows this house better than you do," Holmes replied, moving to the desk and unfolding the papers we had discovered earlier. "Tell me again about the staff." Langford sat down, still pale. "Only Mrs. Weatherby and James. They've been with us for years." "And has either of them had access to this wing of the house, or the attic, or the old plans?" "Well, Mrs. Weatherby certainly. She keeps the household records. James only goes where he's told." Holmes glanced toward me. "We must speak to the housekeeper." Now. She came promptly, summoned by the bell. Her hair was down, her apron slightly askew, clearly roused from sleep. Yet her eyes were alert and her voice steady. "Mr. Holmes? You've been in this house for 3 decades, I believe." "Yes, sir." "And you never once thought to mention the hidden corridors that snake behind your employer's walls?" Her mouth drew into a thin line. "I didn't know, I swear it. I'd heard tales when I first arrived, that there were passages built into the structure for staff to move unseen, but they were sealed before I came. I never had cause to look." Holmes studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Very well. And the attic? The journals?" "Locked, until Mr. Langford went looking yesterday. I never touched them." "Has James been with you long?" 7 years. Quiet boy, reliable. Never a bit of trouble." "Where is he now?" She hesitated. "In his quarters, I suppose. The servants' rooms are on the lower floor." Holmes turned to Langford. "Wake him." Langford left the room at once. Holmes moved to the fire and lit a fresh pipe, his movements mechanical, but his thoughts clearly elsewhere. When Langford returned some 15 minutes later, he looked deeply unsettled. "He's gone." Holmes's head turned slowly. "Gone," I repeated. "Vanished. His bed hasn't been slept in. His trunk's been emptied. The window in his room was unlatched." Holmes sighed a long, quiet breath. "Of course it was." I looked at him. "You suspected him?" "I suspected someone with access and physical dexterity. James is a young man, fit and familiar with the rhythms of the household. But more importantly, he kept himself unremarkable. The perfect mask." "But why?" Langford asked. "What could he want with Eliza, or with that mirror?" Holmes turned and lifted one of the old letters from the desk. "Langford, your family's inheritance is not just wealth. It is secrecy. That mirror came from a monastery that was known for hiding knowledge others wanted erased. Someone, perhaps James, or someone working through him, believed there was more hidden here, within or beyond the mirror. A message, a secret, something worth risking madness and exposure for." I frowned, but all he left with was his life. "Or so it would seem," Holmes murmured. "But there's more to uncover. We must examine the mirror again, closely, this time from the back." We returned to Eliza's room as the first pale blush of dawn touched the horizon. Holmes directed the mirror to be carefully removed from the wall and tilted forward, its heavy silver frame groaning in protest. Behind it, carved into the plaster where no one could see unless they dismantled the entire frame, was a small metal plate, no bigger than a playing card, secured with tiny rivets. On it was engraved a series of words in Latin. Holmes translated aloud, "Within lies truth. The lie is in what you see. The eye misleads. The echo remembers." Below the inscription was a single name etched with precision. "CDA," Holmes said, whispering the initials. "Watson, do you recall the name Caligari?" I nodded slowly. "The monk, the one who studied reflection and mind control. This is his signature." We stood in silence. The mirror, it seemed, was never a portal for ghosts. It was a device, designed to manipulate, to create belief so complete it could break the mind. Someone had tried to awaken that power again, using fear as their instrument, and that someone was now in hiding. Holmes turned to Langford. "Eliza must never be left alone. Post a guard at all times. The figure may have gone, but the influence remains." And then, as if to answer us, a sound echoed from the far end of the corridor. A knock, software measured, repeating, coming from behind another mirror. Holmes did not move. He remained perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the dismantled mirror as the knock came again. 3 sharp raps, then a pause. The sound was unmistakable. Not the accidental groan of timber, nor the settling creak of an old house, but a human knock, deliberate and paced. I turned toward the hallway from which it came. At the end of the corridor stood a smaller guest bedroom, used only on rare occasions, according to Langford. The mirror in that room, we had been told, was a smaller cousin to the cheval glass in Eliza's chamber, oval, wall-mounted, and framed in the same tarnished silver. Holmes walked toward it without a word, the rest of us following in breathless silence. The air had chilled again, though the early sun had begun to illuminate the windows. I felt it more keenly now, the unnatural pressure of the unseen. Langford unlocked the door, and we entered. The guest room was plain, drapes drawn, a four-poster bed neatly made, and the mirror directly across from it, affixed to the wall between two sconces. The knocking had ceased. Holmes approached the mirror slowly, examining the floor first, then the wall, his fingers brushing the frame with the lightest of touches. "Note the alignment," he murmured. "This mirror is set directly opposite the corridor. If one stood behind it, concealed, they could observe the hallway, or," he added, turning to me, "project a sound from within." He placed his ear to the glass, motioning for silence. A long pause followed. Then a single sound emerged. Not a knock, but a whisper that did not come from the hallway or the floorboards. It came from the mirror itself, a soft, dragging syllable. "Help!" Langford's face drained of color. "My God!" Holmes stepped back. "We dismantle it. Now." With Langford and I assisting, we carefully unscrewed the fixtures, holding the mirror in place. As Holmes had suspected, behind it lay another panel, nearly identical to the one concealed behind Eliza's mirror, but this one was already ajar. The latch had been broken from the inside. Holmes opened it fully, revealing a hollow space just wide enough for a man to squeeze through, extending back into the walls. The dust on the floor was disturbed, and a narrow trail of blood, dry, flaked, led into the blackness. Holmes reached for the lantern. "Watson, stay close." We entered the passage. The air was stale and thick, the silence so complete it rang in the ears. The passage twisted, rose, and fell, connecting with the same system of hidden spaces we had discovered earlier. The blood trail continued, winding like a faded thread through the dark. At times, we had to crawl on hands and knees, brushing against cobwebs, the walls close enough to scrape skin. Then finally, the tunnel opened into a wider space, an unfinished room with brick walls and a slanted ceiling. The smell hit us first, iron, decay, and something sourer, fouler. Holmes raised the lantern. At the far end of the space, hunched against the wall, was a figure. James. He was breathing, barely. One leg was twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle, and a deep gash marred his forehead. His shirt was torn, and one hand clutched a rolled sheaf of yellowing parchment, clenched tightly even in unconsciousness. Holmes knelt and examined him. "He's alive," he confirmed. "Dehydrated? The injury to his leg may have immobilized him." Langford knelt beside him. "Why didn't he call out?" Holmes gently pried open one eye. "Shock. Possibly sedated." He carefully removed the parchment from the young man's grip and handed it to me. "Hold that," he said. "I'll tend to his injuries as best I can for now, but we'll need to move him carefully." As I held the scroll up to the lantern, I could barely believe what I saw. It was a map, hand-drawn, annotated in Latin and Italian, with notations in a third hand that I recognized from the old letters in the mirror's base. It appeared to be a blueprint of Langford House as it once was, before renovations, before generations of furniture and taste had covered its secrets. The walls were crisscrossed with tunnels, crawl spaces, and what appeared to be mirror installations marked with numbers, and at the center of it all, in looping black ink, were two words that chilled me. Specularium Centralis. "Holmes," I said quietly, "what is the specularium?" He glanced over from James. "The central mirror room, likely a chamber constructed by those Venetian monks for their experiments. The entire structure of Langford House may have been designed to revolve around it. Langford was shaking his head in disbelief. "Are you telling me my family has been living above an occult laboratory?" "Not occult," Holmes corrected. "Psychological. Perhaps even scientific in a dark way. They studied perception, manipulated fear, belief, and reality through reflection. They created architecture that was not merely structural, but symbolic. And someone has been using that legacy." I frowned, still scanning the map. "There's a chamber here. Below the main drawing room, it's marked the Eye." Holmes's brow furrowed. "Then that is where we go next." We lifted James carefully, using cloth from Holmes's satchel to bind his leg. With great difficulty, we returned to the surface, emerging into the hallway once again. Mrs. Weatherby cried out when she saw James rushing to his side. We instructed her to call the doctor immediately and keep him under constant supervision. Then, guided by the map, we descended through the wine cellar, past a crumbling archway that had once been bricked over, and into a forgotten chamber beneath the drawing-room floor. The Eye. It was circular, perhaps 15 feet wide. The walls were tiled with mirrors, not glass, but polished silver, curved inward to create the sensation of infinite reflection. In the center of the room was a pedestal. On it sat a single object, a mask. It was identical to the one worn by the figure who had emerged from the cheval mirror. But now, without the illusion of movement or shadow, it appeared unmistakably artificial. A propriedad, a tool of deception. Holmes approached the pedestal and examined its base. It, too, bore an inscription. "He who wears the mask commands the fear." "Watson," Holmes said softly, "we have found the engine." "What do you mean?" "This is no mere hiding place. This was the central control. The mirrors throughout the house were angled, aligned, and polished with such precision that a man stationed here could observe, mimic, and influence events above. The entire house is a machine for suggestion, for manipulation, for fear. And James, was he its operator?" Holmes turned the mask slowly in his hands. Number James was a pawn, a curious one, perhaps even ambitious, but someone else guided him, someone older, more practiced. "Who?" Holmes looked up and his expression darkened. "I don't know yet, but I fear the one behind this has not vanished. They may even still be within the house." Just then, Langford called down from above. "Eliza's awake. She's asking for Holmes." We exchanged a glance and made our way swiftly back up. In her room, Eliza sat upright for the first time in days. Her hands were clasped, trembling slightly, but her eyes were clear. "I remember something," she said, looking directly at Holmes. "When he stood before me, the man in the mirror, he whispered a name." "What name?" Holmes asked gently. She closed her eyes. "Miss Arkwright." Holmes straightened. The name meant nothing to me, but from the expression on Holmes's face, it meant everything. Holmes's expression shifted so swiftly I might have missed it had I not been watching him closely. An infinitesimal narrowing of the eyes, a stiffening at the corners of the mouth. He stepped forward, hands clasped lightly behind his back, his voice low. "Eliza, are you certain of the name?" She nodded, her eyes unfocused, as if peering into some inner space. It was a whisper, almost part of a breath, but clear. He said, "Miss Arkwright knows." Then he vanished. Holmes turned to Langford. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Langford shook his head. "Arkwright? No, not among our acquaintances. There was a gardener named Arkwright once, years ago, but he died when I was still a boy." Holmes was already pacing, fingers twitching behind his back as his mind began its quiet, fevered computation. "The name is not unfamiliar to me," he muttered. "Miss Arkwright." "Yes, Amelia Arkwright, a scholar of optics and applied perception. I recall reading a paper of hers some years ago, The Refraction of Memory in Mirror Space. It was published under the auspices of a private philosophical society based in Bologna. She disappeared in 1895. Some thought she had taken holy orders. Others whispered something more arcane. He stopped abruptly, turning to me. Watson, when we examined the journal from Hester Langford, did you notice any mention of a Miss A among her correspondence? I frowned, recalling the fragile pages and curling ink. There were initials. E.A. appeared more than once in the margins, some notations beside mirror sketches. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. Amelia Arkwright. I suspect she was involved with Hester Langford, perhaps even the one who introduced her to the Venetian order that constructed the mirror. Langford was watching him with visible unease. But what does that mean now? She would be an old woman if she were alive. Why would a name whispered in my sister's delirium matter? Because, Mr. Langford, Holmes said, the man who used the mask, who has been manipulating this house, invoked her name not to taunt, but to warn. Miss Arkwright is no longer a researcher. She may be the architect of the entire system, and if that is true, then she is not merely a figure from the past. She is the one pulling the strings. There was a long silence. Holmes reached for his coat. I must speak with a man in Hampstead, an antiquarian who once sold me a book on the reflective studies of the Brotherhood of St. Speculum. He may know where Miss Arkwright was last seen. You're leaving? I asked. For 2 hours only. In the meantime, Watson, I need you to remain here. Do not let Eliza be alone. Guard the mirrors, and watch James. If he wakes, I must know what he remembers. I nodded grimly. And if Miss Arkwright is involved? Holmes turned at the threshold. Then this house is not haunted by ghosts, but by a doctrine. He was gone before I could reply. The hours passed slowly. I remained near Eliza, seated in the drawing room that adjoined her quarters, watching the light shift through the curtains. James had been moved to a guest room and was being monitored closely by the doctor, who reported no change in consciousness. The household was hushed, but not still. The very walls seemed to breathe, as if aware of our presence, of Holmes's absence. It was nearly dusk when the first disturbance came. Mrs. Weatherby appeared in the doorway, visibly shaken. "Doctor." "Watson," she said. "Someone's left a letter. It was slipped under the front door. No signature." I took the envelope from her. It was thick, vellum-papered, the handwriting sharp and deliberate. Inside was a single line. "The final mirror opens at midnight." There was no address, so no seal. Just that. My pulse quickened. I looked at the hallway clock. 6:45. I summoned Langford and instructed the servants to double-check every window, every entry point. Mrs. Weatherby remained with Eliza. I stood outside the mirror in her bedroom and examined it again, running my fingers along the frame, pressing each joint. No fresh scratches, no movement, but still I felt it. That weight, that hum, as if something were coiled behind the glass, waiting. At 9, Holmes returned. His face was pale, his coat dusted with road grit, but his eyes shone with intensity. "She lives," he said, barely pausing as he entered. Or rather, she hides. In the marshes, near Wapping, under the name Miss Eames. She lives alone, speaks to no one, and orders strange apparatus by post. My contact tracked her through academic orders for years. I've sent a telegram. She may respond. He turned to me. "Any changes?" I handed him the letter. He read it once, then again, slower. "Midnight," he murmured. "Then we have little time." We spent the next 2 hours methodically searching every known passage, examining the walls and mapping out the house's original plan over the newer renovations. It was Langford, flipping through an old gardener's ledger, who uncovered the final clue. "Look," he said, pointing. An entry from 1872. Glasswork completed. Installation final. Garden mirror chamber prepared. Holmes snapped the book shut. Of course, the west garden. There's a low wall there, overgrown with ivy. We went at once. The evening was cold, and the garden eerily quiet. The overgrowth clung to the stones like moss, and it took us 10 minutes to clear the vines. Beneath them, a small wooden door was revealed, inset into the garden wall itself. Holmes examined the hinges. Not rusted, recently used. He drew his revolver, nodded to Langford, and pushed the door open. Inside was a narrow passage leading beneath the garden, brick-lined and descending. At the end, a faint glow pulsed, warm and golden. We moved carefully, steps muffled by the old earth. As we drew nearer, the light grew stronger, and a strange scent filled the air, lavender and burnt wax. The tunnel opened into a chamber, larger than the others. Its walls were lined entirely with angled glass. Dozens of mirrors, small and large, faced inward toward a circular space in the center, where a single chair stood, high-backed and wooden. And in the chair, a woman, tall, slight, cloaked in black. Her hair was snow-white and drawn into a loose braid. Her eyes, when she turned to face us, were gray and utterly clear. "Mr. Holmes," she said calmly, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Holmes stepped forward. "Miss Arkwright, I presume?" She nodded. "Amelia Arkwright, the last custodian of the Langford Specularium." Langford stared at her. You knew my great-grandmother." "I did. She was the first to understand the mirror. I'm the last to keep it from being misused." Holmes kept his pistol lowered. "You sent the letter?" "Yes. James was unstable. I tried to guide him, but fear took root in him, too deep to extract. He began to believe the mirror could make him more than a man. He wanted to control it, to manipulate minds through suggestion. I warned him, but he entered the eye. He wore the mask, and it broke him." Langford's voice was hoarse. "You built this place beneath my home. I preserved it. It was here long before you, before any of us. The monks built it to study human consciousness. What is fear, Mr. Langford? It is a reflection of what we cannot understand." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And now?" Arkwright folded her hands. "Now it must end. Tonight the mirror closes. At midnight I will shatter the eye. It cannot be allowed to seduce another mind." Holmes studied her, then lowered his pistol entirely. "I believe you." Langford stepped forward. "But what about Eliza?" Miss Arkwright's voice softened. "She will recover. The mirror only touches what is already fragile. It did not create her fear. It revealed it. But she is strong. She will heal." I saw Holmes exhale slowly. The tension in him eased for the first time in days. Miss Arkwright stood, moved to the center of the room, and placed a small silver hammer on the pedestal. "At midnight, the mirror dies," she said. "Leave now, and take the girl far from here." We left her there, seated in the chair, surrounded by countless reflections of herself. As we emerged from the tunnel and shut the garden door behind us, Holmes turned to me. "There are men who study truth, Watson, and there are those who reflect it." I said nothing. The silence of the house behind us said all that needed to be said, and when the clock struck midnight, a sound rippled through the earth, like distant thunder or a mirror shattering. The sound echoed faintly through the stones beneath our feet, a brittle shiver of air, sharp as a whisper on glass. Holmes and I stood still in the garden, the frost-bitten silence swallowing the resonance that followed. Not an explosion, not a collapse, but the unmistakable sound of something ancient being broken, intentionally, and at last. Langford stood beside us, his face pale in the lantern light, his breath pluming before him. "It's over?" he asked, as if the words themselves might wake the earth again. Holmes did not answer immediately. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening for the final echo to die away. Then, quietly, "The eye has been shattered. Miss Arkwright kept her word." We made no move to re-enter the hidden chamber. Holmes said it best when he turned to me with a grave calmness in his voice and said, "Let the dead light fall where it may. What lies within that room is finished." We returned to the house in silence. The corridors, once thick with an unseen pressure, now felt oddly lighter, hollow but no longer malignant. It was as if a current had shifted direction, and something that had once watched us had finally turned its gaze elsewhere. Eliza was awake when we arrived. Not merely conscious, but awake in the full sense. Her posture straight, her complexion pale but no longer ghostly. She met Holmes's eyes as he entered, and there was a flicker of recognition, of quiet gratitude. "I heard something," she said, her voice steadier than before. "A sound, like glass breaking." "You heard correctly," Holmes replied. "And with it, the end of the influence that has kept you prisoner." She looked toward the mirror across from her bed, then back to him. "It's gone, then?" Holmes nodded. "The mirrors no longer see. They no longer remember." She closed her eyes and drew a slow breath, and for the first time since we had stepped foot in Langford House, she appeared at peace. Langford stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes. You may begin by removing every mirror that shares that silver frame." Holmes replied briskly, "Burn them if you must. Bury them in the sea if you prefer. But do not allow them to remain within these walls. Some reflections once cast are better lost." "I will," Langford said. "This house will be rebuilt. Not just its rooms, but its spirit." I remained with Eliza as Holmes moved through the house one final time. He checked each chamber, each corridor, each hidden passage now exposed by our long investigation. There was no sign of James. The doctor had reported him missing not long after midnight. The window in his guest room had been left ajar. Whether he had limped into the night or had been taken by a force beyond our reach, we did not know. Holmes did not dwell on it. "Some disappearances," he often said, "serve justice more truly than the law." Before we departed, he left a sealed envelope with Langford. "If Miss Arkwright survives her task," he said, "this will reach her. If not, then it contains instructions regarding the architecture of Langford House and the destruction of certain plans still hidden in your family archive. Follow them to the letter." Langford took the envelope and, after a pause, nodded solemnly. "You believe this story will end quietly?" "No story ends quietly," Holmes replied. "It simply ceases to echo." By mid-morning the fog had lifted. The sunlight, pale but resolute, broke through the eastern windows of Baker Street as we returned, trailing the scent of smoke and stone behind us. Holmes did not speak until we were once more within the sanctuary of our flat, seated with brandy in hand, the fire crackling gently before us. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "another case for your memoirs, though I suspect this one may strain even your most loyal reader's credulity." I managed a wry smile. "It wasn't ghosts in the end." "No," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "It never was. Fear is the most natural of phenomena, but when amplified, when bent and shaped by architecture and illusion, it can mimic the supernatural with terrifying precision." "You still believe Miss Arkwright acted in good faith?" He hesitated. "I believe she sought to preserve what she once believed was knowledge, and I believe she destroyed it when she understood the cost. That is more than can be said for most." I leaned forward. "But the house, the way it was built, the passageways, the alignments, the mirrors, it all seemed deliberate, a design centuries old." He gave a slow nod. "Yes, Langford House was not built as a residence. It was built as a vessel, a laboratory of perception. The Langfords never truly lived there. They observed it, inherited it, maintained it. And now, Now it sleeps, until someone foolish enough rediscovers its design. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night settling into memory. Holmes glanced toward the window, where the pale light had begun to warm the pane. "One final detail, Watson," he said softly. "Do you recall the phrase carved into the base of the mirror?" The echo remembers. "Yes." He turned toward me, eyes serious. "Then remember this. The mind reflects what it fears, but the mirror reflects what we deny." We sat for a long time after that, the silence between us no longer tense, but thoughtful. Outside, London resumed its endless breath. Horses clattered along the street, a newspaper boy called out headlines, and the distant toll of church bells marked the passing of another hour. And somewhere, perhaps far from here, a woman with snow-white hair sat among shards of silver, watching her reflection dissolve into light. The case of the ghost that entered through a mirror had come to an end. But for Holmes and for me, it would remain, like all true mysteries, a ripple in the glass that never quite smoothed over. 3 days passed in quiet stillness, as if the city itself had drawn a breath and held it. Holmes returned to his customary habits. Long hours in his armchair with his violin untouched beside him, the smoke from his pipe curling in idle spirals toward the ceiling. He had not spoken of Langford House since our return, nor of Miss Arkwright or the mirrors, but I knew that his mind had not moved on. He was waiting. On the morning of the 4th day, a small package arrived at Baker Street. Brown paper, tied with red twine, bearing no return address. Holmes received it without comment, though I saw the briefest flicker in his eyes. Recognition, or perhaps confirmation. He untied it methodically. Inside lay 2 items: a silver shard, no larger than a coin, wrapped in velvet, and beneath it a letter written in an unmistakable, elegant hand. He read it in silence, then passed it to me without a word. The letter was brief. "Mr. Holmes, the mirror is no more. The chamber lies in ruin. I remain for now, but my purpose is complete. The house will forget. The line will end." The AI looked up. She survived. Holmes nodded, and fulfilled her task. He held the shard up to the light. The surface was dull now, no longer polished, its reflectiveness lost, as if the memory it once held had been scrubbed away. He turned it over between his fingers. "A keepsake," he murmured, "from a machine that was never meant to be admired." I studied the silver sliver. It caught the light in a peculiar way, no gleam, only distortion, as if even now it bent what little it could perceive. "And what of James?" I asked. "Do you think he escaped?" Holmes rose and crossed to the window. The sunlight was faint this morning, dusted with the softness of early spring. "James will not return. Whether the mirror's destruction ended his influence or he vanished into the deeper shadows of his own making, I do not know. But men like him, once they've tasted that kind of control, cannot rejoin the world as it was." He turned back to me, and there was something in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or the residual weight of knowledge too close to danger. He believed the mirror would make him a god of perception. In truth, it made him its prisoner. I was about to speak when a knock came at the door, firm, unmistakable. Mrs. Hudson answered. A constable stood on the threshold, cap in hand, his eyes darting past her to the hallway beyond. "Message for Mr. Holmes," he said, "from Inspector Lestrade. Urgent." Holmes accepted the folded note, and as he opened it, I caught the familiar crest of Scotland Yard at the top. He read it silently, then held it out to me. "Holmes. An incident at Belgrave Sanatorium. Unusual. 1 patient dead, another escaped. The staff are spooked. Claim the dead man spoke in his sleep before he died. Spoke of reflections, of being watched through walls. Thought it might interest you. Lestrade." Holmes folded the paper neatly and placed it on the mantel. Then, quite suddenly, he smiled. "The ripples, Watson," he said. "They haven't stopped yet. You think this is connected?" "I think fear," he replied, "is never fully destroyed. Only dispersed, and sometimes when a vessel shatters, what was contained within leaks out into unexpected corners." We dressed and departed at once, the hansom cab rattling through the morning streets. Belgrave Sanatorium lay on the city's western fringe, a grey-walled structure originally built as a retreat for wounded soldiers and now housing those deemed unfit for society. The guard at the gate admitted us with the weariness of one used to bad news. Inspector Lestrade was already waiting by the entrance. He looked up as we approached, his usual brusque demeanor tempered by something like unease. "Morning, Holmes." "Watson." "Tell me," Holmes said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Who died?" "Name was Marcus Chappelle, minor arsonist, confined here 2 years ago after setting fire to his family home. Claimed he'd been pushed to it by voices in the mirror. We chalked it up to mania." "And the other?" "Michael Harrow, quiet patient, served tea in the mornings, disappeared from his room last night. Left no trace." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "No trace." Lestrade gestured for us to follow. "See for yourself." We were led through 2 locked doors, down a corridor that smelled of bleach and damp stone, and finally to a room with a narrow bed, a metal washstand, and a single mirror mounted above a writing desk. Holmes moved toward it immediately. The mirror was old, simple, with a wooden frame. But something about the room made my skin crawl. He leaned close to it, then placed his fingers lightly on the glass. "No dust on the sill," he said. "The window hasn't been opened in days. But look here." He pointed to the wall behind the mirror. At first, I saw nothing. Then, with the angle just right, I noticed it. A faint, square outline, slightly paler than the surrounding paint, as if a panel had once been there and had recently been removed. Holmes stepped back. "Another passage?" "Not here," Lestrade said. "No architecture to support it." Holmes turned to the bed. The sheets were undisturbed, too neatly folded. "No sign of struggle?" "None," Lestrade confirmed. But the night orderly reported something odd. Said Chappelle, hours before he died, sat up in bed and said, "He's coming through again, the one with no eyes." Then he went still. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then softly, "James, you think he's here?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied. "I think he passed through here, like wind through a broken window." He turned back to the mirror. "These are not isolated events, Watson. Miss Arkwright believed the eye had to be destroyed to prevent misuse. But fear doesn't confine itself to walls. It finds new mirrors." Lestrade looked doubtful. "You're not telling me we're dealing with some sort of contagion?" "In a sense, yes," Holmes said. "Not of the body, of the mind, of suggestion. Chappelle believed what he saw. Harrow, perhaps, was shown something that made him flee." I stared at the mirror. "Then what do we do?" Holmes adjusted his coat. "We find Harrow, and we find where he's gone." Lestrade frowned. "You've no idea where to begin." "Oh, I do," Holmes said quietly. "Langford House was the first aperture. The others may follow its pattern. We must look for buildings, old ones with mirrored architecture. Structures rebuilt over centuries, but still holding to certain alignments." I realized what he was suggesting. "You think there are more?" "I think," Holmes said, "that we closed one eye." He looked back at the mirror once more, and in its surface, for just a moment, I thought I saw something shift, an outline behind the glass that didn't belong to any of us. Holmes turned and walked away. And this time, I followed without asking. The wind sharpened as we stepped back out into the street, slicing through coat sleeves and collar folds with a chill more biting than any I'd felt in weeks. Holmes pulled his collar up and walked briskly ahead, his hands clasped behind his back, boots tapping steadily over the damp cobblestones. I fell in beside him, still shaken by what we'd seen at Belgrave. "You believe Harrow was shown something," I said, "but not by Chappelle, not by anyone at the sanatorium." "No," Holmes said without looking at me. "Not anyone living there. Harrow was a quiet man, unobtrusive, invisible to most. But someone noticed him. Someone or something trained him to notice back." "You think James did it?" Holmes paused at the edge of the street, waiting for a carriage to pass. "I think James was only the first to hear the echo. When the eye was broken, it did not silence the past. It scattered it, like fragments of a melody, and certain minds, sensitive ones, can still hear it." He hailed a cab, and we climbed in, the wheels clattering as we turned toward the Strand. "And where are we going now?" I asked. "To the Records Office of the Royal Institute of Surveyors. There are few buildings in London with optical symmetry designed into their foundation. Langford House was one. I need to know if others exist." The ride passed in silence, save for the rhythmic patter of hoofbeats. Holmes remained still, his fingers interlaced in thought. When we arrived, he led the way inside, where a dusty hush hung over the tall stacks and marble floors. The clerk behind the desk, young and bleary-eyed, looked up in confusion as Holmes approached. "I require access to structural plans, predating 1850, Holmes said, "specifically those involving mirrored interiors, concave or convex walling, and reinforced crawl spaces." The clerk blinked. "That's rather specific, sir." Holmes gave a tight smile. "Then you'll find it easily." 20 minutes later, he had what he needed. 3 maps, folded crisply and bound with twine, each bearing the names of long-forgotten estates. He opened them on the table one by one, his eyes scanning faster than I could follow. "Here," he said, stabbing one with a finger. "Gatcombe House, built in 1813. The architect was a Charles D. Ashwell. Same initials as found on the mirror plate at Langford. Look at the layout. See these long parallel halls? Mirrors on either side. The plans even specify light trap channels." "Where is it?" "North of the city, abandoned since 1902 after a fire. Reconstructed partially in 1908 as a convalescent retreat. Temporarily reopened in 1911. And now." Holmes folded the map. "Vacant, but not undisturbed. I'd wager a month of Lestrade's lectures that someone has returned to it." We made arrangements to leave by train that afternoon. The station at King's Cross bustled with soot and noise, but Holmes remained fixed on the plan, speaking little save to clarify what supplies we would need. Lanterns, ropes, chalk, and a journal in which he had already begun sketching mirror alignments. We reached the town of Wexley by dusk and hired a coach from there. The driver, when told our destination, went visibly pale. "Gatcombe?" he asked, hesitating. "You'll not find anyone there, sir. No one stays after dark. The place echoes." Holmes offered no reply. We arrived shortly before sunset. The estate loomed at the edge of a dying forest, where gnarled trees bent in unnatural angles, as though retreating from the house itself. Gatcombe was a pale ruin now. Cracked stone steps, arched windows long emptied of glass, and ivy climbing across every surface like a patient infection. But the structure remained largely intact, a shell waiting to speak. We lit our lanterns and entered. Inside, dust muffled our footsteps, though in some corners it had been disturbed, smeared, cleared or brushed aside entirely. Holmes crouched beside a trail near the entryway. "Recent," he said. "Boot prints, narrow foot, light tread. Harrow, perhaps." He rose and led the way deeper in. The corridor stretched far, each wall once mirrored. Now many were shattered, their frames empty, but enough remained to catch the flicker of our lanterns. Our reflections seemed to move with a delay, as though hesitant to follow. At the end of the corridor, we reached a doorway, half concealed behind a sagging curtain. Holmes pulled it back and stepped through into a circular chamber, and we froze. The room was a twin to the eye beneath Langford House. Mirrors lined the walls, some whole, some cracked, none covered. In the center sat a single chair. On it was a jacket, Harrow's. Holmes approached it slowly as if suspecting a trap. He examined the chair, then reached down and picked up a torn scrap of paper from the floor. I moved to look over his shoulder. It listens. It does not speak. It waits. The space behind the mirror is not empty. There was no signature, but scrawled at the bottom was a drawing, a spiral, intersected with a slash. The same symbol we had seen etched in the passage behind Langford's mirror. Holmes turned toward the far wall and ran his fingers along the edge of the mirror there. There's something behind this one, he said. Together, we shifted it, hinged like the last, though rusted stiff from disuse. It groaned open slowly, revealing a narrow space beyond. We lit a second lantern and entered. The passage descended, not unlike the ones we had followed before, but here something had changed. The silence was heavier, oppressive, as if sound feared to linger. At the bottom, the tunnel ended in a small room, barely large enough for two men to stand upright. The walls were covered in notes, hundreds of them. Some neatly pinned, others scratched directly into the plaster. They all spoke of mirrors, of voices, of a figure glimpsed in reflection, never present in the room itself. A man with no eyes. He found the echo, Holmes murmured. He followed it here. He reached up and gently peeled one of the papers loose. It was newer than the others. The mask is not a disguise. It is a lens. Through it I see what others fear, but what I fear now sees me. Holmes's jaw tightened. Then we heard it. A soft creak above. Footsteps. Not behind us, but within the walls. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, plunging us into darkness. We held our breath. The steps passed overhead. Slow, deliberate. Then silence. Holmes reached for my arm. He's still here, Harrow, or what remains of him, but he no longer hides. We waited in stillness for several more minutes before Holmes relit the lantern. When we emerged from the passage, the chair in the center of the mirror room was no longer empty. A man sat slumped there. He wore no jacket, and his clothes were torn. His face, thin and pale, was turned away from us. In his lap sat the same wax mask we had seen before, its hollow eye sockets gleaming. "Harrow," Holmes said quietly. The man turned. His eyes were open, wide but glassy. He was dead, but his lips, they moved. No sound came, only the faintest shimmer in the nearest mirror. A ripple. Holmes stepped back slowly. "This is not over," he whispered. "Someone, or something, is still watching." And the mask, now lying on the floor, reflected nothing at all. Holmes did not move. The silence in the room was suffocating, thick with the kind of expectancy that clings to the back of the throat. We stood, frozen, before the slumped figure of Michael Harrows, whose body remained perfectly upright, as though held in place by something more than muscle or bone. The mask at his feet stared upward, hollow and unreadable, as if daring us to pick it up. But what truly unnerved me, more than the open eyes or the stillness, was the subtle movement of Harrow's lips. They formed no recognizable word, and yet there was a rhythm to it. A repeated phrase or name perhaps, murmured not aloud, but within. Holmes stepped forward with extreme caution, lowering himself to one knee before the corpse. He did not touch it. Instead, he leaned closer, his head tilted slightly, listening. I could see the flicker in his gaze, that glimmer of calculation behind his stillness. Then he stood, slowly, and gestured to the nearest intact mirror. "Look closely," he said. I did. The surface reflected the room as expected. The broken stones, the decaying furniture, Holmes's tall form beside me. But Harrow's chair, it was empty. Not a reflection, Holmes said, his voice taut. An exclusion. The mirror is calibrated to show the room, minus him. That's not possible, I whispered. And yet it is, Holmes replied. These mirrors are not ordinary glass. They were constructed for a purpose Miss Arkwright never fully explained, but perhaps never fully understood herself. They can be manipulated, bent, shaped, not to reflect what is, but what is wanted. I turned to the other mirrors in the chamber. Some were cracked, others dark with grime, but each one, when viewed carefully, omitted Harrow. The chair remained. The mask lay visible. But the man was gone. Holmes moved to the nearest wall and retrieved one of the pinned notes, his brow furrowed as he read. I wore it. I saw the void. And now the void wears me. He turned to me. These entries are not gibberish, Watson. They're documentation, a journal of sorts. Harrow was not only subject to the influence, weakened by it. He became a participant. He submitted himself to it willingly, and perhaps, finally, irrevocably. What could drive a man to that? I asked. Holmes's mouth drew into a hard line. The promise of truth, the illusion of control. These mirrors offer not reflection, but distortion dressed in familiarity. Once you begin to question what you see, you begin to question what you are. I felt a tremor pass through me. And now? Now, Holmes said, glancing back to Harrow's unmoving form, we document everything. We returned to London, and we burned this place to the ground. We moved quickly. Holmes took rubbings of the etched designs near the base of the main mirror. I transcribed what I could from the more legible notes. But the air had shifted in that room. The longer we stayed, the more oppressive it became. I could feel something in the walls, a low, pulsing tension like static waiting to discharge. As we finished, Holmes crouched once more by the mask. He didn't touch it, but observed the surface closely. I don't believe this is the same one James wore, he said. The wax is different, the craftsmanship cruder. It's a copy. I swallowed. Then someone else has the original. He nodded once. Or perhaps the original has someone. He didn't elaborate. We returned the way we came, retracing our steps through the house's decaying halls. The sound of our own boots echoed oddly, as though more than 2 sets of feet had walked with us. I found myself glancing at each cracked mirror we passed, half expecting to see something out of place, an extra figure, a flicker of unfamiliar motion. But the glass remained still, dim and watchful. Outside, the forest had grown quiet. Even the wind had dulled, as though holding its breath. We did not speak until we reached the edge of the property. Holmes turned back, his silhouette sharp against the house's broken facade. The light of our lantern caught his profile, stoic, focused, unreadable. I wonder, he murmured, if this was the last of them. The last mirror chamber, I asked. No, he said. The last seeker. The next day, back in Baker Street, Holmes compiled everything, maps, symbols, letters, journal fragments, into a black folder, which he locked in the bottom drawer of his desk. He wrote a sealed letter addressed to Miss Arkwright, though we had no way of knowing if she would ever receive it. The final shard of mirror she had sent us remained on the mantel, untouched. For several days, Holmes said nothing of Gatcombe. He resumed his violin practice. He even accompanied me on a routine consultation with a patient from Paddington, but I knew he was watching, waiting for a sign. And then one arrived. It came in the form of a telegram. Short, unnervingly so. The spiral has opened again. Northwest quarter. 2nd floor. Come alone. There was no signature, only the unmistakable stamp of knowledge, the kind that reaches Holmes through unseen channels. He showed it to me in silence, then folded it and placed it in his breast pocket. "I must go." "Alone?" I asked. He nodded. "You saw the message? And if it's a trap, then I will spring it with care." I wanted to protest, but I knew better. This was how he operated, on the knife's edge of risk and deduction. I only said, "Leave word if you don't return." He smiled faintly. "I always leave word." He departed before dusk. I did not sleep that night. The following morning I woke to the sound of footsteps in the stairwell. When I opened the door, Holmes stood there, coat dusted with soot, hands scratched but steady. He walked past me without a word, placed a rolled item on the table and sat down. It was a mirror, cracked, and within the fracture lines I could just make out something etched, so faint it was almost hidden, a spiral, intersected by a single line. "What happened?" I asked quietly. Holmes did not answer immediately. He poured a measure of brandy into his glass and drank it in silence. Then he spoke. "There's another chamber. Not large, not old, but active. Someone rebuilt the pattern. Someone who understands the spiral better than James or Harrow ever did." He turned the mirror to face the fire. "They're not seeking power now. They're seeking permanence." The implications sank in slowly. "A new order." Holmes nodded. "A new observer. And they're not finished." We said nothing for some time. Finally, Holmes stood and walked to the window. Outside, London moved on, oblivious, bustling, shrouded in mist. He looked out with an expression I could not decipher. And then, softly, "Watson, how many mirrors do you think exist in this city?" Holmes remained by the window long after the brandy had gone still in the glass, his silhouette limned in the grey morning light. Outside, the street bustled with the mundane. Vendors shouting, carriage wheels rattling over stone. But within our rooms at Baker Street, an invisible weight still lingered. The mirror fragment on the table caught the weak sunlight, casting fractured lines across the floor like slashes from an unseen hand. I waited, knowing better than to press him. Holmes, for all his logic and rationality, had been affected by this case in a manner I rarely witnessed. The enemy had not been a person alone. It had been perception itself, distorted, weaponized, and scattered across a city that never truly looked at itself. At last, he spoke softly, as though to himself. "It is not the mirror we must fear, Watson. It is the man who learns to shape what others see." He turned to me, and his expression was calm, resolute even, but with a glint in his eye that told me the game was not yet finished. "There is a pattern beneath it all," he said. "Langford House, Gatcombe, Belgrave. 3 places, each tied not just by structure, but by design. Deliberate design. The spiral symbol, the mirrored chambers, the recurrence of suggestion through fear. These are not accidents of architecture. They are iterations of a larger construct." I leaned forward. "You believe someone is recreating these chambers across the city?" "Not recreating," he said. "Refining." He placed a thin folder on the table, filled with notes, sketches, and correspondences. "While you slept, I had Miss Hudson deliver inquiries to our contacts across the Royal Society of Architects and the University of Edinburgh's Department of Cognitive Studies. There's a man, Dr. Elian Crest. He vanished from the academic world 5 years ago. Former student of Miss Arkwright, obsessed with perception and influence. His name appears on early drafts of the Langford schematics." He opened the folder and tapped a single sheet. He also signed for the building permits tied to a warehouse on Candlewick Street, a place not used for commerce, but one that aligns perfectly with the geometry of the eye. I felt a coldness bloom at the base of my neck. "And you believe this Crest is building a new mirror chamber?" Holmes nodded once. "The last one." He stood, moving to the fireplace, and fed the cracked mirror shard into the flames. It caught quickly, the silver backing hissing as it peeled away. He watched it burn. "I will go there tonight," he said. "Alone." I opened my mouth to protest, but he raised a hand. "Let me finish. You will not come, Watson, because you, more than anyone, must remain untouched by what lies at the center. These places, these mechanisms, they prey upon fear, and you have seen too much already." "You're wrong," I said firmly. "If you walk into that place alone, you'll be exactly what Crest wants. Isolated, disoriented, a mind without witness. I won't allow it." Holmes's gaze softened then, the faintest smile touching his mouth. "Your loyalty, my dear friend, has always been your most dangerous virtue." He reached into the side drawer and pulled out a small velvet pouch. From it, he withdrew a perfectly round mirror, no larger than a coin, set in a brass frame. "This," he said, "was recovered from Gatcombe. Not broken, not corrupted. A pure reflective surface. I believe it may offer protection of a kind. Not because it defends, but because it reminds." He handed it to me. "If I do not return, you will know where to begin." I took it, reluctant but steady. That evening, Holmes departed with only a lantern and his notebook. I waited in Baker Street, unable to sit, my thoughts circling endlessly. The hours passed like shadows over a sundial, slow, silent, and insistent. Just past 3 in the morning, the door opened. Holmes stepped inside. His coat was torn, his hands blackened with soot. But his eyes were clear. "It's done," he said. I rushed to him. "Crest?" "Gone," he said, seating himself with effort. Not dead, but fled. He had built a chamber, primitive but functional. He was experimenting with group transmission, attempting to cast not just a figure through reflection, but emotion. I found his notes. He believes fear can be engineered, then transferred, amplified across mirrored surfaces to create mass perception. An entire city, Watson, made to feel the same shiver at once. I poured him water. Did he succeed? Holmes took a long drink. We dismantled the chamber before he could. But the design, he will try again. Somewhere else. He leaned back and closed his eyes. "I left something behind," he said. "Not a trap, a record. The mirror he'd shaped to anchor his work. I used it against him. I wrote on its inner surface, with silver nitrate, a warning." "What did you write?" He opened his eyes and looked at me. The eye sees only what it is taught to fear. We sat in silence after that. Dawn broke slowly across the rooftops of London, and the street outside began to stir with morning life. Holmes rose and stood at the window once more, watching. "Will he return?" I asked. "Not as a man," Holmes said. "Not in form, but his idea—" "Yes, that may return. Ideas do not burn the way buildings do." I stepped beside him. "Then what do we do?" He glanced at me, and this time his smile was real. "We watch, Watson. We watch every mirror, every strange ripple, and when it returns, we'll be ready." Behind us, the last embers of the burnt mirror hissed one final breath and faded into ash. And thus ended the case of the ghost that entered through a mirror, an illusion born of glass and fear, unraveled by a man who refused to look away, fused 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 to look away.